Hi, everybody. My name is Stella Nyambura Mbau. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. And for my presentation on climate-resilient livelihoods, I thought it best to start with a background in climate resilience. So I'm going to be sharing my slides quite a lot. So this will be founded on the climate resilience theory. Then I'll use that theory to contextualize climate-resilient livelihoods. The climate resilience theory takes a precautionary approach. It's about risk reduction. That is, climate change presents risks, and it's important to respond to them in a way that reduces suffering. I'll go ahead to briefly define each of its 4 indicators, that is, climate change, adaptation, vulnerability, and resilience. Climate change is a change in climate brought about by global warming that has caused a shift in climate systems. This then triggers extreme weather events like wildfires, floods, and droughts. Adaptation, on the other hand, means reducing vulnerability to climate change. This is by introducing or installing new coping mechanisms. At this point, I'd like to mention maladaptation, which is an unsuccessful adaptation. So even as adaptations are used, it's important to explore the potential negative consequences in order to avoid increased vulnerability in future, because adaptation has one job: to reduce vulnerability. Are we facing climate change with or without adaptation? This brings me to vulnerability versus resilience. Vulnerability is the degree to which a thing, system, community is not able to recover from a climate event, usually due to a lack in adaptation, which is a reality for most vulnerable communities. And where there is reduced vulnerability, there is increased resilience. So, what is resilience? This is the ability to bounce back into shape after an event, to absorb the shock and maintain function. At this point, I'd also like to mention transformation. It refers to the opportunity to bounce back to a desired state. Much like the conversation around post-COVID-19 and building back better to a different, greener, new normal better. Now we can move to climate-resilient livelihoods. Going by the definition just given for climate resilience, a climate-resilient livelihood means a livelihood that has the ability to bounce back into shape after a climate event. A livelihood in itself is a set of activities through which we meet our needs. That is, how do we get food, water? Examples are the communities that depend on fishing or agriculture. These are referred to as primary activities, while those in urban areas depend on manufacturing, others on services, which are referred to as secondary activities. Let's switch back to the slide. So let's contextualize this in the theory I presented earlier. Firstly, with regard to climate change, the most prevalent climate risks are floods, droughts, and sea level rise. These are already being experienced in many parts of the world. Be that as it may, some parts of the world are more vulnerable than others. Secondly, with regard to adaptation, the extent to which a thing, system, community needs to adapt is subject to its vulnerability. How do we know how vulnerable they are? The answer is that there's a tool, the Livelihood Vulnerability Index. It enables you to assess the impact of climate change on livelihoods. Vulnerability is a function of how much a community is exposed, sensitive, and able to adapt to climate change. Each of these indicators can be measured, this way letting you know where the gaps that need to be addressed are. Results of such an assessment have implications on where stakeholders direct their adaptation efforts with their monies, so that limited resources are channeled to areas where they are needed the most. I'll explore this idea of climate-resilient livelihoods further using these two scenarios: farming livelihoods and coastal livelihoods. I'll start with the farming livelihoods. The impact of drought and flood cycles is usually first felt in agriculture. These risks particularly affect sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where livelihoods and ecosystems are highly sensitive to changes in climate. Agriculture, especially in Africa, is mainly rain-fed, so drought and flood cycles are very disruptive. Also, farming is heavily dependent on family labor, so bad health in one or more family members could affect food production. So, with more and more events on the offing, these communities are getting more and more locked into poverty. But before recommending adaptation measures to address these vulnerabilities, it's important to understand the gaps, which is where the Livelihoods Vulnerability Index comes in. I'll give an example. Back to the slide. To recommend adaptation measures for 2 rural regions in Ghana, Wenchi and Techuman, I hope I pronounced those right, a Livelihoods Vulnerability Index assessment was carried out. Farmers from these 2 areas mostly farm maize, and after tallying scores using the Livelihoods Vulnerability Index, which I'm sure you can't see, but I still will draw your attention to the right side of the chart, Wenchi was found to have a higher vulnerability. The following recommendations were made to reduce this. There was a need to build more community health centers, also for the drilling of boreholes to access water. So the sensitivities addressed here are Wenchi's access to health and water resources, as you recall from the Livelihood Vulnerabilities Index. The farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia could adapt to climate change and climate risks by implementing adaptation measures such as, firstly, climate smart technologies in order to increase crop yield, using seed balls, for example, as used in arid areas of Kenya, where seeds are dispersed with not so much regard for when the rains will come. The idea is to disperse them, and whenever the rains come, the seed will pick it up from there. Secondly, diversification of livelihoods by getting involved in on and off farm activities. An example from Bangladesh, the diversification of things you could farm all at once. A response to floods is where farmers have adopted to a model that integrates fish, fruit, vegetables, and duck farming all in one. It's done using floating farms, so when storms come, the farms rise with the rising sea, and farmers don't lose much of their produce. Finally, an unpopular adaptation measure: migration is a good thing. That's Lewis Hamilton's Jersey said that. When soils lose their productivity, leading to the lack of food, people may be left with no other option but to move, through no fault of their own, to find other places that could better support them. I'd like to give an example from Kenya that shows how to respond to vulnerabilities using community-specific solutions. So agro-pastoral communities are allowed to pay their National Health Insurance Fund contributions in the form of goats. I really mean goats. This way, they're able to access insurance, which reduces their vulnerability. Some conditions that discourage the adoption of these adaptive measures in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia include limited information, poor access to services, ICT infrastructure, poverty, conflicts, I guess mostly African, inadequate access to health facilities, and other many reasons. Finally, cases of maladaptation to look out for are, for example, when communities look to selling firewood and charcoal production as adaptation measures. These are maladaptive and could lead to even more vulnerability in future because it means deforestation, and that has heavy negative implications in the long run. The second scenario I'd like to look at is coastal livelihoods. Coastlines are threatened by flooding from coastal storms, coastal erosion, oil spills, most recent Mauritius case, sea level rise, which causes salt intrusion on agricultural land. A good example of that is Myanmar, which is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change and sea level rise. But there are fishing livelihoods as well. Freshwater fish populations are rapidly declining because climate change is altering the timing of migration and spawning. So to adapt to these coastal challenges, some strategies include mangrove, which are salt tolerant and can withstand harsh coastal conditions, as well as biogenic reefs. In one of the adaptation experiments in France, coastal retreat was considered an adaptation. For coastal communities, it's challenging to consider this a solution, but the framing around sea level rise as a global issue rather than a local one, the conversation around relocation became one that could be had. This points to the need for community engagement and creating awareness, and the potential for that communication space is to change perceptions is huge. To wind this up, I'll give the conclusions and recommendations, one of each. One of the conclusions is that creating awareness, education, and training help reduce vulnerability. Because, a farmer knows that in September I shouldn't plant because the rains don't have to come in September as I'm used to. That saves them from losing the seed and, helps with decision making. One of the recommendations as well is that adaptation policies should accommodate migration as an adaptation measure. The other recommendations are, we're going to have a limited role in disaster management, and to use disaster risk governance would allow for their voices to be heard, not just women, also other minority groups. So with that said, thank you for listening. Stay healthy, and bye for now.